Caroline, Robert Davis stopped suddenly on the frozen sidewalk, his heart beating really fast as he looked at the woman sitting on the park bench, and at first he thought it was just another homeless person trying to stay alive during the cold December night. But when the street light turned on and showed her face, his stomach felt sick because it was her, the woman he had told to leave his house 3 weeks ago, and she wasn't moving at all. It was really late at night, the kind of late when Chicago streets become quiet and the cold gets into your bones, and Robert had just finished eating dinner with business people where they had yummy food and fancy drinks and talked about ways to make even more money than he already had. His driver sent him a text message saying he was stuck in traffic with all the cars. So Robert decided to walk home instead of just standing around and waiting for him. That's when he saw somebody on the bench and he almost kept walking right past her because that's what grown-ups do in the city. You see people sleeping outside and you just keep going because if you stop to help everyone you'd never get anywhere. And Robert had become very successful by not stopping to help people. But something made him walk slower. Maybe it was the way she was curled up trying to stay warm. Maybe it was something he couldn't understand or explain. Maybe God just wouldn't let him walk past her without stopping. He took one step closer to her, and the street light buzzed and turned on, lighting up her face so he could see who it was, and his chest felt tight like he couldn't breathe. Caroline was her name, the woman who had worked cleaning his big house for 2 whole years, always quiet and doing her job, until 3 weeks ago when he fired her, which means he told her she couldn't work for him anymore because she came to work late. Now she was here on this bench with her lips looking blue from the cold, her skin very pale like paper, and her hands were holding onto something really tight even though she looked like she was sleeping. Robert dropped down on his knees in the snow, which ruined his expensive suit pants, but he didn't care right then. He said really loud, "Caroline, can you hear me? Are you okay?" But nothing happened. She didn't answer or move or open her eyes. He carefully opened her frozen hands that were so cold they felt like ice, and inside she was holding some money, a big stack of small bills like $1 bills and $5 bills and $10 bills, and underneath all that money there were papers from the hospital that were all wrinkled up. The papers said patient Ethan Smith, who was 12 years old. Diagnosis, which means what's wrong with him was leukemia, which is a very bad sickness. Insurance terminated, which means the insurance company that helps pay for doctors stopped helping. And it said 17 days without treatment, which means he hadn't gotten medicine from doctors for more than 2 weeks. Then Robert found a letter that was written by hand in pen. A letter that she never sent to anyone but kept with her. The letter said, "I'm not asking you to give me money for free. I just want my job back because my brother is dying." And when Robert read those words, his hands started shaking really bad. 3 weeks ago she had been late to work. She broke something in his house, and he told her to leave and never come back, but he never asked her why she was late or what was wrong. Now she was here on a bench holding everything she owned in the whole world, and it still wasn't enough money to help her brother. Robert ripped off his warm cashmere coat, which is a very expensive and fancy coat, wrapped it all around her to keep her warm, and called 911 on his phone, which is the number you call when someone needs help right away. As the sirens from the ambulance got louder and closer, one thought kept hitting his brain over and over like someone was knocking on a door. She had been waiting for him to help her and he had never looked down to see her when she needed him. Before we keep going with this story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Because sometimes God puts someone right in front of us and we're too blind to see them until the exact moment we can't look away anymore. And this is that moment for Robert. Robert's home was the kind of place that felt more like a museum where you look at things but don't touch them than a place where people actually live and feel comfortable, because everything had its own special spot where it belonged. The floors were so clean and shiny you could see your reflection in them like a mirror. The kitchen counters didn't have anything on them except for a coffee maker machine that he used every single morning at exactly 7 o'clock. No mess anywhere, no toys or books lying around, no warmth or coziness, just the kind of perfect neatness that comes from having someone else clean up all your messes for you. That morning 3 weeks ago, Robert came down the stairs wearing his business suit with his phone already in his hand because he was checking his emails before his feet even touched the bottom floor. His assistant who helps him with work had sent him numbers about the stock market, which is where people buy and sell parts of companies, and his brain was already doing math and thinking about money. He walked into the kitchen expecting his coffee to be ready and waiting for him like it always was, but it wasn't there on the counter. He made a confused face and looked at the clock on the wall which said 7:30, and he called out Caroline, but nobody answered him. 1 minute later the back door opened really fast and Caroline came running inside. And she looked so tired, like she hadn't slept in a very long time. Her coat was wet even though it was freezing cold outside, which seemed weird. Her hands were shaking as she put down her bag on the floor, and her eyes were red like maybe she had been crying or like she hadn't slept for many days. She said very quietly, "I'm so sorry, Mr. Davis, the train was late and I tried so hard to get here on time, I promise I tried." But Robert interrupted her and said without even looking up from his phone, "You're late and that's not okay." And she said, "I know, if I could explain what happened." But he said, "I don't need you to explain anything, Caroline, you're fired, which means you don't work here anymore. Get your things and leave my house right now." Her face became very still and frozen like a statue. She didn't cry or argue or try to change his mind. She just stood there for a couple seconds looking very sad and defeated. Then she nodded her head yes and turned around to walk toward the back room where she kept her jacket and shoes and personal stuff. Robert poured himself some coffee into a cup and sat down at the kitchen counter. And by the time she came back through the kitchen with her bag on her shoulder, he had already moved on to reading his next email like nothing important had happened. She didn't say anything at all to him. She just walked out the side door and closed it very quietly behind her like she didn't want to bother him. The agency that finds cleaning people sent someone new to work for Robert that same afternoon, but the new person talked too much and didn't know where anything was supposed to go in the house, but Robert didn't say anything about it because he didn't really care that much. By the end of that week, Robert couldn't even remember what day Caroline had left because she wasn't important enough to remember. But Caroline remembered everything about that morning because she had come straight from working an overnight cleaning shift across town at a different job. From 11 at night until 6 in the morning, scrubbing and cleaning floors in an empty office building that was dark and lonely. She had barely made it onto the train to get back across the city, and her whole body was screaming at her that it needed sleep so badly. But she couldn't afford to miss this job at Robert's house too because she needed the money. Not with Ethan's hospital bills piling up higher and higher like a mountain of paper. Not with the insurance company sending her letters every other day saying they wouldn't help pay anymore. She had tried so hard to hold everything together and keep going, but her hands had been shaking from being so tired. Her eyes couldn't see clearly because everything was blurry. And when she reached up high to get something from the top shelf, her body swayed just for 1 second because she was dizzy. That's when the expensive vase fell off the shelf and crashed on the floor and broke into pieces. Now 3 weeks later, after being fired, Caroline had no job to make money, no apartment to live in because she couldn't pay rent, and her little brother Ethan had been without medicine and treatment from doctors for over 2 weeks. But Robert didn't know any of that because he never asked her what was wrong, or why she needed help. Robert sat in the hospital waiting room under bright lights that were so bright they hurt his eyes and made his head hurt. His fancy coat was gone because it was wrapped around Caroline somewhere in the back part of the hospital, and his shirt was still wet and damp from kneeling down in the snow outside. People kept staring at him weird because he looked strange. A man wearing a suit that cost $1,000 sitting all alone at 2 o'clock in the morning looking like he had just watched his whole life fall apart into pieces. He didn't care that people were staring. He kept reading the hospital papers over and over again trying to understand. Ethan Smith, 12 years old, leukemia, which is cancer in the blood, treatment stopped 17 days ago, and he felt sick reading it. A nurse who takes care of patients walked past him, and he heard part of her conversation when she was talking to another worker at the hospital. She said hypothermia, which means her body got too cold, severe malnutrition, which means she hasn't eaten enough food. She's been living outside on the streets for at least a week, maybe even more than that. And Robert's stomach felt like he was going to throw up. The other nurse made her voice quieter and said, "There's a kid in our hospital system with the same last name as her, 12 years old, on the oncology floor, which is where kids with cancer stay. His treatment was stopped when the insurance got cut off and wouldn't pay anymore." The first nurse asked, "How long does he have to live without treatment from doctors?" And the answer made Robert feel frozen inside when he heard it. "Days, maybe just a week if we're lucky." Robert stood up so fast from his chair that it made a loud scraping sound across the floor. His hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone and called the oncology department, which is the part of the hospital that helps kids with cancer. He said into the phone, This is Robert Davis. I need to talk to someone right now about a patient named Ethan Smith who is 12 years old and has leukemia. And his voice sounded tight and weird. He said, I'm saying yes to pay for whatever he needs. Full treatment with all the medicine and doctors. I don't care how much money it costs. Start helping him tonight right now. There was a pause where nobody said anything on the other end of the phone. Then a voice said, Sir, that's almost $500,000, which is $500,000. And Robert said really firmly, I know exactly what it costs, just do it and help him now. He sat back down in his chair, his chest feeling tight like something heavy was sitting on it, and suddenly he wasn't in this hospital anymore in his mind. He was 23 years old again, standing in a different hospital waiting room many years ago. His younger brother was in a bed down the hall, 14 years old, hooked up to all kinds of machines that beeped and made noises, and his brother had the same sickness, the same desperate need for treatment and medicine that they couldn't afford to pay for because they were poor. Robert had just started his first company back then and he was broke, which means he had no money. He had used up every credit card he owned and couldn't borrow any more money. And when the hospital said they needed more money or they would have to stop giving his brother medicine, Robert didn't have the money to give them. He remembered his brother asking him with big scared eyes, Are we going to be okay? And Robert had lied to him and said, Yeah, I'll figure it out and fix everything. But the truth was he didn't figure it out in time to save his brother. Robert built his whole empire and became super rich after his brother died. And he told himself he would never be powerless again. Never be too poor to save someone ever again. And yet here he was now, rich beyond anything you could imagine, with more money than most people could count. And he had fired the one person who needed his help the most. A doctor wearing a white coat appeared in the doorway and said, Mr. Davis, she's awake now, you can go see her if you want. And Robert stood up with his heart pounding really hard in his chest, wondering if Caroline would even want to look at him after what he did. Caroline's eyes opened very slowly, like she was fighting her way back from somewhere very far away. And the hospital room was warm, way too warm after being outside in the cold. She heard beeping sounds from machines, saw white walls all around her, and smelled that clean hospital smell that smells like medicine and cleaning supplies. She blinked her eyes, trying to remember where she was and what had happened, and then panic hit her all at once like a wave crashing over her. She tried to say something, but her voice came out weird. Then she heard Robert's voice coming from beside the bed saying, Ethan, he's okay. Your brother is okay. She turned her head on the pillow and saw Robert sitting right there next to her bed, still wearing his wrinkled shirt that wasn't neat anymore. And he looked like he hadn't slept in many days. Robert said, He's stable, which means he's doing okay. Treatment started last night. The doctors say he's responding well, which means the medicine is working. Caroline just stared at him without saying anything. Then tears started running down her face before she could stop them. But they weren't tears of relief or being thankful. They were something closer to not being able to believe what she was hearing. She whispered so quietly you could barely hear her. Why did you help us? Robert opened his mouth to say something but then closed it again because he didn't have a good answer to give her. Caroline said again with her voice getting a little bit stronger. Why now? You had 3 whole weeks. I wrote you a letter. I stood outside your office building for 3 nights waiting to see you. Where were you when I needed help? Robert looked down at the floor and said, I didn't know you needed help. But Caroline said back, You didn't ask. You never asked what was wrong. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, That morning when I was late, I had been up all night working another job to get money to pay for Ethan's medication. I hadn't slept in 2 days and you didn't ask me anything, you just told me to leave and never come back. Robert said, I know, but Caroline said, No, you don't know, you don't understand. And she sat up a little bit in the bed, her voice shaking as she talked. She said, Men like you don't know what it's like. I wasn't late because I overslept or was being lazy. I was late because I was trying to keep my brother alive, and you threw me out like I was nothing, like I was garbage. Robert's jaw got tight and he pulled out his laptop computer and opened it up on the edge of her hospital bed. He said quietly, You're right, I didn't see you before, but I'm seeing now, and what I'm seeing is bigger than just you and Ethan, it's much bigger. He turned the computer screen toward her so she could see it. And on the screen were rows and rows of information, names of people, denial codes, and dollar amounts. Robert said, This is my company's insurance system. It's been saying no to people and denying claims for 3 years, targeting poor families on purpose. Over 18,000 people have been hurt. Your case isn't the only one. It's part of a pattern that keeps happening." Caroline stared at the computer screen and her face went from being shocked to something harder and colder looking. She said, "You're telling me that Ethan almost died because your computer decided we weren't worth the money it would cost to save him?" And Robert answered, "Yes, that's exactly what happened." Her hands made fists on the hospital blanket and she asked, "How many other people?" Robert scrolled down on the computer to show her more and said, 43 people got denied yesterday alone." Caroline closed her eyes and when she opened them again they were filled with something Robert hadn't seen before. Not tears, not fear, but rage, which means really strong anger. She said, "You don't get to save my brother, and then walk away feeling good about yourself." And she looked right at him. "You fix this, all of it, every single person your system hurt. You fix it right now." Robert said, "I don't know how to fix something this big." But Caroline's voice cut through the room like broken glass when she said, "Then you learn how. You have money, you have power, you use it to help people. Because if you don't, then Ethan lives, but I spend the rest of my life knowing I was saved while thousands of other people weren't." And she looked him dead in the eyes and asked, "Can you live with that?" Robert didn't go home that night or the next night. He spent 2 whole days in his office pulling files and looking through records, tracing every denied claim back to where it started to figure out what was happening. The more he found, the sicker he felt inside, like his stomach was turning over and over. It wasn't just a computer making mistakes, it was designed on purpose, it was deliberate, which means someone meant to do it. The system flagged people based on where they lived, by their zip codes, how much money they made, and their medical history of being sick. And once you were flagged, the computer looked at every claim you sent in until it found a reason to say no. Caroline's file was right there in the system. Robert found it buried in the employee records where it was hiding. She had been flagged 2 years ago when Ethan's diagnosis first went into the computer system and said he had cancer. The computer algorithm had marked her as high-cost dependent risk, which means it thought she would cost too much money, and over the next 2 years it had recommended her termination, which means firing her 6 different times. 6 times someone had overridden it, which means they said no, don't fire her yet, until the day the vase broke. Robert's hands were shaking as he kept digging deeper and looking for more information, and then he found the emails that proved everything. They were from his CFO, which stands for Chief Financial Officer, named Edmund Wallace, sent to the head of the insurance division part of his company. The subject line at the top said, Q4 cost optimization, which means making the company spend less money. Robert opened the first email and read it. It said, "We need to reduce how much we pay out for dependents by 18% this quarter. Flag all employees with dependents requiring long-term care over $120,000 annually. Begin phased terminations, which means start firing them slowly." The next email Robert found was even worse and made him feel more sick. It said, "Employee number 4738. Termination will save approximately $1,280,000 annually on dependent cancer treatment. Approve immediate coverage cessation upon exit," which means stop paying for medicine as soon as she's fired. Employee number 4738 was Caroline. They were talking about her and Ethan. They had calculated Ethan's death like he was just a number on a page, like he was a line item on a list to save money. Robert sat back in his office chair with his chest feeling tight, staring at the computer screen, and he felt like he was going to be sick and throw up. A knock on the door made him look up from the computer, and Caroline was standing there in the doorway, still looking pale and tired, wearing clothes that someone from the hospital must have given her because her other clothes were ruined. She wasn't supposed to be out of the hospital yet, but there she was. Caroline asked, "What did you find?" And Robert turned the computer screen toward her so she could read it. She read the email very slowly and carefully. Her face didn't change expression, but her hands started shaking just like Robert's had. She whispered so quietly, they all knew this was happening. Robert said, "It goes higher than just him. The board, which is the group of people who run the company, approved these protocols 3 years ago. They've been getting paid bonuses, which is extra money for every percentage point they cut from spending." Caroline looked at him, and for the first time since she had woken up in the hospital, something broke in her expression and tears came to her eyes. She said, "My brother almost died so they could get richer so they could have more money." Robert nodded his head yes because it was true. She was quiet for a long moment just thinking. Then she said, "When are you going to confront them, which means face them and tell them what you know?" Robert answered, "Tomorrow. I'm calling an emergency board meeting," and Caroline said, "I'm coming with you to the meeting." Robert said, "Caroline, you don't have to do that," but she said, "Yes, I do," and her voice was very still and calm. She said, "They tried to erase me, tried to erase Ethan and pretend we didn't exist. I'm not letting them pretend we were just numbers on a page." She stepped closer to Robert and he saw something in her eyes that he recognized. It was the same look he had 20 years ago standing over his brother's grave after he died. Caroline said very clearly, "I'm not your redemption story, Robert. I'm your reckoning, which means the moment you have to face what you did wrong." The conference room on the 42nd floor was all made of glass and steel, which means metal, and it looked very fancy and expensive. 12 board members sat around the big long table when Robert walked in with Caroline beside him, and the room went completely quiet when they saw her. Edmund Wallace, who was the CFO, stood up immediately and said, "Robert, this is a closed board meeting. Miss Smith has no business being here in this room." Robert said, "Sit down, Edmund." And his voice was calm, but it carried weight, which means people knew he was serious. He plugged his laptop into the big screen at the front of the room and the data filled the whole wall, showing names and denial rates and demographic breakdowns, which means information about different groups of people, and profit margins, which means how much money they made. Robert said, "For 3 years our insurance division has been denying legitimate claims, which means saying no to real requests for help, all to boost quarterly numbers and make more money." The woman standing next to me almost froze to death because of it. Her 12-year-old brother almost died. A board member named Thompson leaned back in his chair and said, "Robert, insurance companies have to make difficult decisions. That's just the nature of the business. Her brother has—" But Robert cut him off before he could finish and said, "Her brother has leukemia, which is cancer. He's 12 years old and your system flagged him as too expensive to keep alive." Wallace stood up again and said, "This is completely inappropriate. We followed standard actuarial practices, which means the normal way insurance companies do things." Robert said, "You sent an email." And he pulled it up on the big screen so everyone could see it. "Employee 4738, you called her a high-cost dependent risk. You calculated how much money the company would save if her brother died." The room went completely silent, so quiet you could hear people breathing. Caroline stepped forward and her voice was quiet, but every single person in that room heard her when she said, "My brother's name is Ethan. He's 12 years old. He likes basketball. He wants to work with animals when he grows up." She paused for a second, then said, "Last week he asked me if dying hurts because he couldn't breathe and I couldn't afford to buy his medication." One of the board members looked down at the table like he was ashamed. Caroline kept going and said, "You see spreadsheets and numbers on paper. I see Ethan asking me why I can't save him. Every one of those 18,000 denials is someone's Ethan, someone's mother, someone's child." Her voice cracked a little bit, but she didn't stop talking. "If that's how you do business, then you're in the wrong business and shouldn't be doing this job." Thompson cleared his throat and said, "This is clearly emotional, but we have shareholders to answer to, which means people who own parts of the company. We can't just—" But Robert interrupted him and said, "I'm shutting down the algorithm today right now. I'm refunding every wrongly denied claim from the past 3 years, which means giving back money to everyone. And I'm giving this board a choice: help me fix this or find another company to run." Wallace's face turned red and he said, "If you do this, we'll vote you out as CEO, which means take away your job as the boss. You'll lose everything you built." Robert looked at Caroline, then back at the board members and said, "Then call the vote and let's see what happens." 5 board members stood up and walked out of the room, but 7 stayed sitting down. Wallace stared at Robert with his jaw tight and said, "You're going to regret this decision." Robert said quietly, "Maybe I will, but at least I'll be able to sleep at night." Security guards escorted Wallace out of the building, and as the door closed behind him, Caroline turned to Robert and asked, "What happens now?" Robert looked at the board members who stayed, then at the data still glowing on the big screen showing 18,000 names of people waiting for someone to fight for them. He said, "Now we go public, which means we tell everyone what happened." 2 days later, Caroline's letter was everywhere. Someone at the hospital had leaked it to the press, which means they gave it to the news people. By morning, her face was on every news website and TV channel, showing her handwriting and her words that said, "I'm not asking for charity, which means free money. Just for my job back, my brother is dying." Robert's phone wouldn't stop ringing with people calling him. His PR team, which means the people who handle public relations, were panicking and very worried. And the board members who had stayed were now questioning their decision and wondering if they made a mistake. But then another story came out and dropped like a bomb. The headline said, "Former housekeeper exploits billionaire's guilt for financial gain." And it was anonymous, which means nobody knew who wrote it. And it was vicious, which means mean and attacking. It said Caroline had planned everything, that she had manipulated Robert, which means tricked him on purpose, that Ethan's condition was exaggerated, which means made to seem worse than it was, that she was using a sick child to get rich. Robert found Caroline in the guest room of his house where she was staying, sitting on the edge of the bed and staring at her phone with tears streaming down her face. She whispered, "They're going to destroy me. They're going to ruin everything." Robert sat down beside her on the bed and she said, "You don't understand." And she looked at him with her voice breaking into pieces. "I've spent my whole life being invisible where nobody sees me, and now I'm everywhere and people are looking at me, and they're making me into a liar and saying I'm bad." Robert said, "Then we tell the truth. Today we do a press conference, which means we talk to all the news people, you and me together." Caroline shook her head no and said, "I can't do it. Look at me. I'm nobody. Who's going to believe me over them, over powerful people with lawyers and PR firms?" Robert's voice was steady when he said, "I will believe you, and so will everyone who's ever been where you are right now." She looked at him for a long time, thinking about it. Then she nodded her head yes. The press conference was packed with so many people, cameras everywhere, reporters shouting questions before Robert and Caroline even reached the podium, which is the stand where you talk. Robert spoke first and laid out everything, explaining the algorithm and the denials and the 18,000 people who were affected and hurt. He announced the $500 million settlement fund, which means money to help make things right, the independent oversight, which means people from outside watching to make sure things are fair, and the new patient advocacy board, which means a group to help patients. Then Robert stepped aside and Caroline stood there with her hands shaking, staring at the wall of cameras pointed at her. For a second Robert thought she might walk away and give up, but she didn't. She said, "My name is Caroline Smith." And her voice was quiet at first. "I'm 30 years old. I've cleaned houses since I was 18 years old. I raised my brother since I was 23. When our parents died." Her voice got stronger as she kept talking. "I worked 3 jobs to keep him alive. I lost my home trying to save him. And I slept on a park bench with everything I own because I'd already lost everything else." The room went completely still and nobody said anything. Caroline said, "But I'm not here for sympathy, which means people feeling sorry for me. I'm here because there are millions like me. People who are invisible until they're dying, ignored until they're gone." She looked directly into the cameras and said, "This company's system didn't see my brother's life. It saw a cost, which means how much money it would take, and that has to end right now." Her voice cracked, but she kept going. "To everyone who's been denied, who's been told your family isn't worth saving, who's had to choose between medicine and food, I see you, we see you, and we're not stopping until this is fixed." Outside through the windows, Robert could see a crowd gathering with lots of people. They were holding signs and pictures of loved ones and names of people they had lost. Caroline's words had found them and reached them, and they weren't going to let her stand alone. That night Caroline didn't say much. Robert drove her to the hospital in silence and she stared out the window the whole way with her hands folded in her lap and her face unreadable, which means you couldn't tell what she was thinking. When they pulled up to the hospital, she didn't move right away, she just sat there. Then she said quietly, "What if he's angry at me?" Robert looked at her confused and asked, "Why would he be angry?" Caroline said, "Because I left him alone," and her voice broke. "I was so busy trying to save him that I wasn't there with him. He's been in that hospital room alone and I was sleeping outside on a bench." Robert said, "You were fighting for his life," but Caroline said, "But he didn't know that. What if he thinks I abandoned him, which means left him on purpose?" Robert didn't have a good answer for that question. They walked through the hospital together and Caroline's steps got slower the closer they got to the pediatric oncology floor, which is where kids with cancer stay. By the time they reached Ethan's room, she had stopped completely outside the door. She said, "I can't go in," but Robert said gently, "Yes, you can, you're strong enough." Caroline took a big breath, pushed the door open and stepped inside the room. Ethan was sitting up in his hospital bed, thinner than Robert expected, wearing a medical mask covering half his face, but his eyes, when he saw Caroline, his eyes lit up like the sun. Ethan said, "Caroline," and she crossed the room in 3 fast steps and wrapped her arms around him, being really careful not to disturb the 4 lines that were giving him medicine. She was crying so hard she couldn't speak or say any words. Ethan said with his voice muffled against her shoulder, "I thought something bad happened to you. They wouldn't tell me where you were." Caroline whispered, "I'm okay, I'm here now, I'm not going anywhere ever again." Robert stayed by the door watching them because he felt like he was intruding, which means being somewhere private that wasn't his business. After a while, Ethan looked over at Robert standing there and asked, "Who's that?" Caroline pulled back from the hug and wiped her face, then said, "That's Robert, he's the one who made sure you got your treatment and medicine." Ethan studied Robert for a long moment with his eyes looking carefully. Then he said, "You're the one who fired her. You're the one who made her lose her job." Robert's chest tightened and felt heavy, and he said, "I am, that's true, but your sister helped me understand, she helped me learn." Ethan looked between them trying to understand what was happening and asked, "Are you fixing it for the other kids too? The other ones like me?" Robert nodded his head and said, "We're trying really hard to fix it." Ethan said, "Good," and leaned back against his pillows looking tired but more alive than he'd been in weeks. "Because it's not fair. Kids shouldn't have to worry about stuff like this. We should just get to be kids." Caroline kissed his forehead and said, "No, you shouldn't have to worry." As they left the hospital later, Caroline was quiet again. But this time it was different. This time there was something like hope in her silence. Robert said, "He looks stronger than before," and Caroline said, "He is stronger. The doctors said he's responding to the treatment. They think he's going to make it and survive." Her voice cracked on the last word because she was crying again. Robert didn't say anything, he just stood there with her while she cried. But this time she wasn't crying from grief, which means deep sadness. She was crying from relief, which means feeling better because something good happened, and the relief was so overwhelming and big it hurt. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red but clear, and she asked, "What happens next? What do we do now?" Robert thought about the 18,000 names still waiting for help, the federal investigation that had just been started by the government, and the lawsuits already being filed by people. He said, "Now we finish what we started." 2 months went by and everything looked different. The federal investigation was moving forward, checks with money were going out to families who'd been denied, the algorithm had been shut down completely and didn't exist anymore, and Caroline's face was no longer on the news, at least not as a victim anymore. Now she was something else, something different. Robert found Caroline in what used to be an empty office on the 15th floor, but now it was filled with phones and computers and people working. Most of them were former patients or family members who'd been through what Caroline had been through. Robert asked, "How many calls today?" Caroline said, looking up from her desk, 37 calls from people asking for help. 12 we were able to help immediately. The rest we're still working on. She looked tired, but different somehow, stronger. Like she'd found something she didn't know she was looking for. Robert said, "The board approved your title, Director of Patient Advocacy. It's official now." Caroline smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes all the way. "I never thought I'd have a title or an important job." Robert said, "You've earned it, you deserve it." She was quiet for a moment thinking. Then she said, "The doctor called this morning about Ethan." Robert's heart stopped beating for a second and felt frozen. Caroline said, "Ethan's latest scans came back clean." And her voice broke with emotion. "He's in remission, which means the cancer is gone." Robert felt something release in his chest. Something he didn't know he'd been holding on to. "Caroline, that's amazing, that's the best news." Caroline said, "I know," and she stood up with tears streaming down her face. "I know it's amazing." They stood there in that small office, and for the first time since that night on the bench, Caroline looked like she could finally breathe normally. She said, "Ethan wants to meet you, really meet you, not in a hospital room." The next day Caroline brought Ethan to the office building, and he was thinner than other kids his age, his hair still growing back in patches and not fully grown yet, but he was smiling, really truly smiling. Robert met them in the lobby downstairs and Ethan said hi, while extending his hand to shake. Robert shook his hand very carefully and said, "Hi Ethan. It's really good to see you here." Ethan looked around at the tall building with all the glass and fancy decorations, then back at Robert and said, "My sister says you're trying to help other kids like me." Robert answered, "We are trying, yes." Ethan asked, "Can I help too? Can I do something?" Robert glanced at Caroline, who looked surprised, then back at Ethan and asked, "What do you have in mind? What were you thinking?" Ethan said very seriously, "I want to tell people what it's like, being sick and being scared and not knowing if you're going to be okay. Maybe if they hear it from a kid who went through it, they'll understand why it matters so much." Caroline's hand went to her mouth and covered it because she was so surprised and emotional. Robert knelt down to Ethan's level so they were eye to eye and said, "I think that's exactly what people need to hear. You're very brave." That night Robert sat in his office long after everyone had gone home, and the building was empty and quiet. He was thinking about a boy who wanted to turn his pain into purpose, which means using something bad to do something good, thinking about a woman who'd refused to stay invisible, thinking about how many lives could change if people just stopped long enough to really see each other. His phone buzzed with a new message and it was from Caroline. The message said, "Foundation Gala, which is a fancy party, is in 2 weeks. Ethan wants to speak and talk to everyone. Are you ready for this?" Robert stared at the message for a long time thinking about what to say. Then he typed back, "Let's show them what redemption looks like." The ballroom was completely full of people. There were donors who give money, advocates who help people, families, press, which means news people, people who've been helped by the foundation, and people who were still fighting for help. Robert stood backstage adjusting his tie for the third time because he was nervous. Caroline was beside him wearing a simple dress and she looked more nervous than she'd been at the press conference. Robert asked, "You okay? Are you feeling all right?" She nodded and said, "Just thinking about how different everything is now. How much has changed?" Robert said, "Good different." And Caroline smiled. "Yeah, good different." Then Ethan appeared wearing a suit that was slightly too big for his body. His hair had fully grown back now and there was no mask covering his face anymore. Ethan said, "I'm ready to go," and Caroline knelt down and straightened his collar to make it neat. She said, "You don't have to do this if you don't want to, you can change your mind." Ethan said, "I know I don't have to, but I want people to understand. I want them to know it's not just about money, it's about being seen and noticed." The lights in the ballroom dimmed and got darker, and someone called Ethan's name out loud. Ethan walked onto that big stage like he'd been doing it his whole life, like he wasn't scared at all. He said into the microphone, "My name is Ethan Smith. I'm 13 years old. And 6 months ago I was dying because a system decided I wasn't worth saving." The room went completely silent, so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Ethan continued, "But my sister didn't accept that, she didn't agree with it." And his voice was steady and strong. "She lost everything trying to save me, her job, her home where she lived, almost her own life." He paused for a moment. "And when she woke up in that hospital after almost freezing to death, she didn't just save me. She decided to save everyone, every person who needed help." People in the audience were crying. Robert could see it from where he was standing in the wings watching. Ethan kept going with his speech. "I'm standing here tonight because someone finally stopped walking, someone finally looked down and saw us, and I think that's what God does. He puts people in front of us when we're not paying attention, and he keeps putting them there until we finally see them and can't ignore them anymore." Caroline was sobbing quietly beside Robert, covering her mouth with her hand. Ethan finished by saying simply, "My sister taught me that being strong isn't about not breaking into pieces. It's about getting back up when you do break. So thank you for getting back up for all of us." The applause in that room shook everything. It was so loud like thunder. Later, after all the speeches were done and the photos were taken and people drank champagne, Robert found Caroline on the rooftop terrace, which is like a balcony on top of the building, and she was looking out at the city lights. Robert asked, You good, are you okay? And she nodded. Just thinking about that bench, about how close we came to everything being different. Robert asked, what stopped you from giving up when things were so bad? Caroline smiled softly and said, the day before I ended up on that bench, Ethan told me you're the strongest person I know, you don't quit, so I didn't quit. Robert was quiet for a moment, then said, I walk past that bench sometimes on purpose. I think about how different everything would be if I'd left the restaurant 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later. Caroline said, turning to face him, but you didn't leave early or late. You were exactly on time. Maybe that's how grace works. It shows up in a coat you didn't expect right in the middle of the worst moment of your life. Robert said, I don't feel like grace, I don't feel like I deserve that word. Caroline said, grace never does feel like it deserves anything. It just shows up and does the work that needs to be done. They stood there watching the city lights twinkle below them like stars. Somewhere down there on the streets, families were getting checks they'd been waiting for. Treatments were being approved by doctors. Children were getting to dream again about their futures. Caroline's voice was soft when she said, we weren't rescued, Robert. That's not what happened to us, we were seen, and once you've been truly seen by someone, you can never be invisible again. Robert thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago, walking past people on the street, building empires and making money, never looking down at anyone, and he thought about the man he was now standing here. He said quietly, thank you for everything. Caroline asked, for what? Thank you for what? Robert said, for not giving up, for showing me what I'd stopped seeing in the world. Caroline reached out and squeezed his hand once and said, we saved each other, that's the truth. And standing there above a city that had once ignored them both and pretended they didn't exist, Robert understood something he'd spent his whole life missing and never learning. Sometimes the people you save end up saving you right back. And that's the most important lesson anyone can ever learn.